Hello, welcome to part two of the lecture. I hope you've been able to pick it up all right. Because of the technology, the lecture is going to go up onto the YouTube site, I think, in 3 or 4 segments. We were just finishing off, I think, the discussion around acid rain, caused by sulfur emissions, and the importance of the science that underlie it, and of the international action that had to be taken to tackle it successfully, particularly across the European Union. There were very strong parallels to the way the issue had developed across in North America, with combustion plants in the US contributing particularly to acid rain across Canada, causing, as you might expect, severe problems between those two countries. Certainly in 1983, there was a significant scientific report produced and submitted to the White House that suggested strongly that action needed to be taken, and at that stage it was rejected by the presidency of the time. And it took, in fact, until around 1990 before the US Congress started to enact legislation amending their Clean Air Act to start reducing SO2 emissions. Even now, the reduction in the US is perhaps not much more than half of the reduction that's been achieved across Europe. So the 1988 Large Combustion Plants Directive in the European Union, to which the UK had to be a party, started to put in place significant reductions in sulfur emissions across Europe, with the consequent reductions in acid rain and the damage that was causing across many countries. Of course, this isn't an issue that's entirely solved across the world. In areas such as India or other parts of Asia, where coal is still used for a lot of combustion, a lot of energy production, then acid rain continues to be a problem across other countries. And certainly because of the link to what was the basic fuel in coal that was used for electricity and indeed for domestic heating, the need to change social and economic policies before you could tackle the environmental issue and the problems that were arising was a major reason why it took so long to respond to the emerging science and for policymakers, politicians, to actually take action. Because the action was in the end driven by the EU directives, by the laws coming out of the European Union rather than individual countries, it also marks an important change in the role of the EU. Increasingly, it wasn't just a common market for trade. It was an international organisation working across different countries to tackle difficult, controversial issues and to produce laws which would apply equally across all European countries. It meant whenever a law was passed by the European Union that they acquired what's called technically competence. That means, very importantly, that when it came to international negotiations on this issue, on any issue where the EU has passed a law, the European Commission speaks for all the member states. That's very significant in any international negotiations, for example on trade, where because trade is an internal market issue, the Commission, rather than individual countries, speak for everyone in the EU in international bodies. They'd also started to expose an ongoing issue where Northern European countries, members of the EU, particularly the Scandinavians, the Dutch and so on, had a much stronger commitment to early and rigorous action on environmental protection than would generally be seen among southern members of the EU. The UK, as we've talked about, tended to sit off to one side of many of these issues, not sharing the boundaries that meant that river or land pollution was as important. Nevertheless, environmental laws started to grow substantially across the EU in this period. In the 1970s, there were 79 laws passed in the EU dealing with environmental protection. This rose substantially to 109 in the 1980s, and in just the first 3 years of the 1990s, another 35 environmental laws. So the importance of the EU, the importance of the Commission taking a role in international negotiations, was a significant part of the way different international environmental issues were being tackled across this time. And the 2 decades, 1972 to 1992, that lay between the Stockholm Environmental Conference and the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 that we'll be coming on to talk about, is 2 decades where the clashes were very fundamental between the North and the South more generally, between the developed industrialised West, the OECD countries as they're called, and the G77, the developing countries. And these clashes had roots in issues of poverty versus environment. Many countries, for example, in parts of Africa and Asia, would see environmental protection as something of a luxury that could be afforded by rich Western countries when they were still dealing with the poverty and developing needs of their populations. And naturally enough, some of those discussions and arguments took place in the context of colonialism and exploitation. Many of these countries had been occupied at various times by different European countries and empires, and they quite reasonably pointed out that it was not really fair for a European country to come to Africa or Asia, take the minerals and raw materials away for their own industrial development, emit carbon dioxide or other pollutants into the atmosphere, and then some years later come back to the table and expect developing countries to make the same commitments to environmental protection that they were prepared to make. This found one expression in the idea of global commons, the notion that the air, the atmosphere, the seas, the land, the global commons should be regarded as equally belonging to all countries and indeed to all individuals. And the environmental footprint of someone in a developed country like the UK or certainly the US compared to the global environmental footprint of someone in an African or Asian country could be vastly different. And so the idea that tackling some of these environmental issues had a strong moral dimension was increasingly emerging. One of the important developments in this period in 1987 was something called the Brundtland Commission, named after the Norwegian Prime Minister who led it. And it was that commission that probably coined the phrase sustainable development and certainly brought out its importance. And you'll all be well aware that sustainable development remains a significant concept that is used across many issues still today. And it probably means that the importance of environmental and development issues being considered together will never go away. And it was the Brundtland Commission, the coining of sustainable development, that led to the creation by the UN and setting the target for 1992 of what was called the Rio Earth Summit, or properly the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And because that was set some years ahead, the Rio Earth Summit in June 1992 provided a target for many of the international negotiations that were being developed at this stage. And as we'll hear about, that target was really important, particularly in the climate change negotiations. And through the 1980s, you might describe it as the decade of environmental woke, when there was a much greater awareness and a much greater concern across many countries around environmental issues, environmental protection. This was demonstrated, for example, by the fact that the NGOs, the non-governmental organisations like a Greenpeace or a WWF, saw their membership across industrialised countries rise from 4 million to 11 million. This was a period of considerable economic recovery, and it allowed people to think more widely about issues that might affect them and the next generations. And in polls taken in the UK, the importance of environmental protection rose hugely from around 10% at the start of the decade to around 35% by the end of the 80s. Some of this was perhaps because it was also a decade that saw significant and damaging hurricanes, serious droughts, beginning to see the rising heat in global temperatures from climate change, continuing significant deforestation in parts of the world like Brazil, but also in parts of Asia. And in 1986, many of you know, the Chernobyl disaster, the meltdown of the reactor on the far side of Russia, which nevertheless, despite being so far away, caused environmental damage to be picked up, certainly as far as Wales, all the way across, and many European countries in between. And the Chernobyl disaster did bring home to everyone, if the lesson needed learning, that environmental issues could never respect international borders. And if we were going to tackle some of these key environmental issues together successfully, then the international community had to come together and start trying to find ways of dealing with them more constructively. That's the end of part 2.